Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Spinning Ukraine, with the Crimeans set to vote on their status, the West continues to threaten Russia with sanctions. How long will this standoff last? And hasn't Washington already blinked? To cross-talk the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Pepe Escobar in Bangkok. He is an Asia Times roving correspondent. In New York, we have Ann Lee. She is a professor at New York University and author of the book, What the U.S. Can Learn from China. And in London, we cross to Martin McCauley. He is a specialist on international affairs at the University of London. All right, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I would very much appreciate it. Pepe, if I can go to you first in Bangkok, I don't think I've come across more divergent narratives about an international crisis since August 2008, when Georgia attacked South Ossetia. It took Western media weeks in most cases to get the story correct because a quote-unquote Russia invaded Georgia, which wasn't the case, and most media have acknowledged that. Now we have the same kind of binary here. It's very different narratives. Pepe, what's your narrative?
Should we go back to Iraq in 2003 in terms of credibility of Western corporate media? So forget about this. Look, the big picture is the new great game in Eurasia. Russia is the Eurasian nation by definition, and Ukraine is the swing nation at the heart of Eurasia. For the US, for NATO, and for some European nations, not all of them, there is a lot of divergence in Brussels as well. It's absolutely essential to, as they put it, conquer Ukraine for the West. So this is a binary thing. It's an either-or operation. Either they are with us or they are going to be gobbled up by Russia. It's not reality. The reality is that Ukraine is split in two, roughly. Western Ukraine is more westernized, and Eastern Ukraine emotionally, politically, economically, industrially is linked to Russia. So ideally, we should have a government of national union, in fact, trying to steer Ukraine into the future. After what we had, which was a reload of an orange revolution, which, by the way, even if it goes on, it's going to fail, just like the first one failed, when we have IMF structural adjustment ahead. It's not going to happen because the antagonistic people who are in power in Kiev at the moment, they are antagonizing Eastern Ukraine, South Ukraine, and Russia at the same time. So obviously this is too complicated for Western corporate media to explain.
Okay. Martin, how do you see things playing out right now? Because right now, as we're recording this program, there's talk of sanctions in London. And these could have consequences here. Too many lines are being drawn in the sand here. I said in my introduction, has Washington blinked? Because this referendum is going to happen in Crimea, and it will have consequences.
The referendum will go ahead, and almost certainly the majority will vote for either independence or perhaps even a stage further integration with Russia. That is that will be public opinion and so on. But looking at Ukraine, economically it's done very, very badly. It's only 60%. The GDP is only 60% of Ukraine's GDP, and Ukraine is only 60% of its neighbors. So Ukraine and Crimea, over the last 10, 20 years, has been a very sad story, a very weak story. And therefore, economically, the uprising and the conflict there is, in fact, really goes back to economic factors, because people are fed up with the government, they're fed up with their standard of living and so on, and they want a better life. And therefore, it's really a struggle about who will give us a better life from the people in Crimea. Is it better to link up with Russia? Will they provide a higher standard of living? Or will Kiev do it? Do you actually trust Kiev? Because over the last 20 years, Kiev has been rather unsuccessful in growing the Ukrainian economy.
You know, and it's very interesting if you look at Western media and you look at Russian media, and everyone's saying this is legal, this is illegal, this is legitimate, this is illegitimate. But of course, they're opposites. We look at the government in Kiev. The West says this is a legitimate government. It was a coup. And of course, we have the people in Crimea that want to vote for their future. And of course, the White House is saying this is illegal. I mean, what is legal and what is illegal? Is it, or just your interpretation here?
It really is about spin, because there are many sides to the story, and depending on how an action's interpreted, it could be illegal or illegal. And clearly from the Russians' perspective, they're saying that they're there to protect Russian citizens. And from the West, they say that, you know, they're violating sovereignty. So this is, depending on your politics, so it doesn't, there's no black or white here, which is no different than, oh, is it legal or illegal for NATO to go bomb Libya? I mean, there are clearly multiple sides to any story, so I don't think that's an easy one to answer.
Yeah, you know, Pepe,
depending on who you ask.
Yeah, Pepe, if I can go back to you in Bangkok, I find this absolutely amazing that Russia is violating Ukraine's sovereignty when we have the Victoria Nuland conversation. I mean, who's violating whose sovereignty here?
Look, one of my readers coined an absolutely fantastic expression, the Kaganate of Nulands. This is what we have in Western Ukraine, you know. It's the Kagan family, very famous neocons, still very influential. Victoria Nuland married to one of them, and it's a new Khanate. So they think that they're going to conquer Western Ukraine and, in fact, plunder, because when we have the 15 billion, the promised 10 billion euro rescue package for Ukraine, it's going to be indebted slavery for the foreseeable future for Ukrainians who think they're going to get a EU passport tomorrow and get great jobs like Polish plumbers and Romanian cocktail waitresses in Paris. This is not going to happen. And Eastern Ukraine, because they are industrially linked to Russia, they know what this means in terms of the plunder, the conditions, and the takeover by central bankers of Ukraine in terms of destroying Ukrainian industry. Very important. Why Yanukovych, with all his faults, yes, why he didn't sign the EU agreement in the first place? Two reasons. Number one, he knew that it would destroy Ukrainian industry. And number two, there was a provision that Ukraine would have to respect NATO military protocol.
Okay, I'd like to go back to Martin in London. You know, in looking at this referendum that's going to be held this Sunday here, do you see it will have a demonstration effect for the other parts of the country, the South and the East?
Yes, I think that if the overwhelming majority of people in Crimea vote for either independence or a closer association with Russia, that will obviously influence the eastern oblasts of Ukraine, which have an ethnic Russian majority. So you're looking at Donetsk, you're looking at Kharkiv, and they will look at that and say, well, perhaps we should do the same thing. There will be pressure among some of the people there to actually go ahead with that. We don't know what the majority point of view is there because they haven't been consulted, but we know that some are in favor of a closer relationship with Russia, and others are not so sure, because at the end of the day, it'll come down to an economic question. Is Ukraine better off being more closely associated with Russia, or is it better off being more closely associated with Western Europe, the European Union, and the West? West Ukraine would obviously vote one way. They would go for a closer association, whereas those in the East don't really want that style of living and that type of competition. They prefer a much more Russian-type development. And they will, in fact, decide eventually, because the government in Kiev at present is quite weak. There's no president. The president has been elected.
Martin explained very clearly for us and our viewers is that there's a lot of vacuums going on right now. How legitimate the government is in Kiev, that's a political opinion, I suppose, right now. And then we have secession. I mean, and again, from a legal perspective, the people in Crimea can say there's no legal government in Kiev for us to talk to. We're on our own right now. Of course, not others look at it. Are we in new territory here, or is just this, again, it gets down to your interpretation?
again, like I said before, it depends on which perspective. And I would say it's actually more about politics here playing than legal interpretations, because, you know, the international courts are really not that strong, and there are many countries that don't participate in that, including the U.S. So I would say that right now it's actually more about politics, and it may be brought up to a UN resolution. If that happens, you know, clearly Russia would veto any such motion. China would likely abstain from any actions, and if economic sanctions do go forward, it's likely only going to be U.S. that's going to really push hard on it, because Europe, especially the Baltic states, are still very much dependent on Russian gas and oil. And so it would hurt their interests economically, and they're already fragile from an economic standpoint. And clearly nobody else wants to upset China either, which, you know, they're dependent on China's cheap goods and services. And so this is more of a political issue, if you ask me, in terms of how this is going to play out and how it's going to be spun going into the future. And while China is in a very awkward position because they don't want to upset the U.S., and yet they'd still like to be friendly with Russia, since both of them do see the U.S. as their main rival. Primarily one, the U.S. Has done the Asia pivot, and this could threaten China's imports of energy from various choke points. So China is eagerly looking to Russia for energy supplies, and Russia obviously wants to diversify their risk. And so they have some compatibility of interests here. And so it will be very interesting how they might, you know, together spin this without, you know, openly antagonizing the West. So this is a very delicate political balance,
all right,
I would say.
We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the events unfolding in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we lost Martin McCauley in London. The uplink went down, but we thank him for his contribution. Pepe, now, if I can go back to you in Bangkok, what was Victoria Nuland thinking in planning this whole adventure in Ukraine? Didn't she expect the Russians would react?
Of course not. These are a bunch of amateurs, Peter. Look at these people: John Kerry, Victoria Nuland, Ben Rhodes. These people are amateurs compared to real diplomats in Iran, in Russia, in much of Latin America, some Europeans. This is completely ridiculous. They were trying to reload the original Orange Revolution with their vodka, orange, tequila sunrise, whatever. And now much more complex, because they were using, basically instrumentalizing neo-Nazis and fascists, the descendants of Stepan Bandera in Western Ukraine. It worked because when there was the moment to pounce, and just like it was discussed by the Estonian foreign minister and Catherine Ashton. And obviously this is not going to be examined at the United Nations. And Russia already tabled it, and the US is going to block it. Snipers were shooting both sides. So in the middle of all this confusion, they took power, basically, and Yanukovych fled for his life with his team. So this is what happened. It's an illegal coup with snipers and with fascists and neo-Nazis involved. Afterwards, they don't know, just like they didn't about Iraq. Remember Paul Wolfowitz, we have to go back to this all the time. You know, the revolution in Iraq is going to pay for itself. We're going to be the new OPEC. All that stupidity. And now it's going to be repeated in Ukraine. Just a small point I'd like to make about China, picking up on what Anne said before. I've been following the Chinese reaction. It's very, very cautious because Chinese diplomacy is reactive. They are terrified that an illegal coup is going now. It's already being legitimized by Washington. They are terrified because this would create a precedent for something happening inside China and legitimized by the US. Could be in Xinjiang, could be in Tibet, could even be in Hong Kong. We have Larry Diamond these past few days talking about democracy, NED style in Hong Kong. And at the same time, they have a very complex political strategic relationship based on energy as well with Russia. So President Xi Jinping, he called both Obama and Angela Merkel, and he said, please resolve this diplomatically. I suggest that Obama and Merkel really listen closely to what President Xi is telling them.
You know, and Pepe just took the question that he answered the question I wanted to ask you. I mean, from Beijing's perspective, this is very reckless in what Washington and Brussels is doing. I mean, it seems very interesting to me that the West will look at Ukraine and say that the Russians will just walk away from millions of Russians living on the border of Russia who live in Ukraine. And again, Pepe brought up, you know, there are these issues in China as well and around the periphery there. I mean, this is extremely reckless behavior that sends a demonstration effect or a worry through the rest of the Eurasian land space.
Most definitely. China wants stability first and foremost. And so what the West is trying to do clearly is, you know, play both sides with China because they're saying, oh, China, since you stand for non-interference, you need to stand up against Russia. Oh, you know, if this is okay, then, you know, you can have various maybe Uyghur states break away from China. And so it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't for China. And so this is, again, very messy politics. And so I agree with Pepe's analysis on this. I would say that China is basically trying to cool everyone's tempers, trying to basically say, let's, you know, try to negotiate something, and then hopefully it'll blow over, and then people will forget about it, and another incident will happen somewhere else in the world so that this doesn't come up again. I think that's really what China's hoping for, because China really can't afford to be dragged into this.
Well, actually, I agree with you completely, because Pepe, one of the things that so many people don't focus too much attention on is that the Ukrainian economy is going over a cliff, and it's going to be very, very not a soft landing, to put it lightly. And we have Western governments that they don't want to pay for the mess that they've created here. Russia was there at the fore to help out with $15 billion. That's disappeared, and it's not going to come back. So what's going to happen to this government in Kiev? Because, you know, I just cannot see it being electable because of its fascist elements, and it has an economy that's about to die.
Absolutely. It's illegal. It's not electable in the long run. It might be electable for what, 35, 40, maximum 45% of the Ukrainian population. They're going to implement an IMF structural adjustment, which is going to be extremely harsh, as we discussed before. Sooner or later, I would say sooner, I would say in 6 months, Western Ukraine is going to wake up to the reality of living like Latin America in the 70s, under the IMF tutelage, for that matter. And soon we're going to have an anti-Euro Maidan in less than a year. Look, let's kick these bastards out because they promised something for us and we're not going to get it. And they thought that they were going to get into the European Union like tomorrow.
Okay, and I think how does this play into Chinese-Russian affairs and relations? Because, again, China is spooked by these colored revolutions, their invented crises, and it's getting closer to them. Does this, how does this bode for the relationship between the two countries? I mean, is Russia and China are going to get closer and closer on this?
Yeah, I would say that both U.S. and Russia have a lot of similarities. One, they both feel that they've been wronged by the West. Russia primarily because a lot of Russians see the collapse of the Soviet Union and the ensuing economic chaos that followed was largely instigated by Western policymakers. China feels wrong because this latest Asian pivot with all sorts of warships and fighter planes being relocated to the Asia Pacific is meant to contain China's rise. And so both sides are actually looking for more allies, and yet neither one of them can really oppose the U.S. openly. What I think is going to happen is that instead of having any formal alliance, because that would really freak out the U.S., they would more or less agree to become friendly and mutually supportive of each other in various international forums. And this is what I expect to see going forward here, because not only do they have certain political objectives in terms of trying to support each other on the global front, Russia looking for China's support to stop Western interference in their sphere of influence, and same with China. The fact that both of them depend on each other economically because Russia would like to divert their energy revenue more to East Asia, given threats of economic sanctions, and China obviously worried about their energy supplies too, and so Russia would be a natural partner. All these areas would bode that their relationship ought to grow closer. Of course, it's a balancing act. Like I said, China cannot afford to upset the U.S. because a lot of their exports are still to the U.S. They still see U.S. as the sole superpower and therefore cannot afford to antagonize the U.S. in any way. And so what I believe we'll see is that this is going to be just kind of a delicate dance of friendship between Russia and China for probably the next 2 decades before we see any breakout relationships.
You know, Pepe, one of the interesting things for me is I started the program talking about South Ossetia in 2008. Well, South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Crimea have something in common. It stops NATO expansion. What do you think about that? Or slows it down?
Absolutely. By the way, the #1 rationale for the Khaganate of Nuland's gambit is NATO bases in Ukraine. So this is part of full spectral dominance. This is part of the empire of bases. We all know about this. It's been fully documented. The problem is the Obama administration, they know, if we have to put it in a soundbite, in fact, Iran, China, and Russia. These are the 3 nations that stand in the way of an American exceptionalist 21st century. And obviously, the deep state in the West, the real ruling elites, the shadow elites, they know it. So what are we going to do about it? The Obama administration, their strategy is pivoting. So now they are lost in their own maze of pivoting. So one day is pivoting to China. Let's encircle them with military bases. Japan, in Singapore, in Vietnam, Philippines, everywhere. Pivoting to Iran. Okay, maybe not. Maybe if we not go into war, like John Kerry said a few weeks ago, I'm quoting literally, we should try to examine the possibility of a nuclear deal. So it's a half-hearted way of trying to get a nuclear deal with Iran. It's already encircled by military bases all across Southwest Asia. And pivoting to Russia, which has been going on since the end of the Soviet Union. Bush father, he promised Gorbachev, NATO is not going to expand. Of course it will. And it did under Clinton, under Bush 1, Bush 2, and still expanding under Obama with lots of neocons inside his own foreign policy team because he's absolutely lousy in picking his own team. And, of course, listening to advice of people who are not qualified to advise him. So it's all these 3 pivoting schemes at the same time. They don't even know what to do. So when you have a State Department initiative, this is basically what it was. The alliance of Nuland with the neo-Nazis, the fascists, and having a central banker to legitimize the whole thing, to apply the IMF structural adjustment afterwards. You know, they were only thinking about the immediate term.
Okay, Pepe, I have to jump in. We've run out of time. CrossTalk is going to keep its eye on this story. Many thanks to my my guests in Bangkok, New York, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, Crosstalk rules.
I love you.